yourself in the sea, and it would obey you. If one of you had hired help plowing a field or herding sheep, and they came in from the fields, would you say to them, "Come and sit at my table"? Wouldn't you say instead, "Prepare my supper, put on your apron and wait on me while I eat and drink. You can eat and drink afterward"? Would you be grateful to the workers who are just doing their job? It's the same with you who hear me. When you have done all that you have commanded to do, say, "We are simple workers. We have done no more than our duty." La palabra de Dios. Gracias a Dios. I just want to make a note about the scripture reading that was read just now. The scripture reading as it's written in your bulletin is not the way that it was written in the version that I read. Do you know what the difference is? Anybody know what the difference is? There's a key word change. David, do you know? Not to put you on the spot, but I did. Anybody know the difference? There's a key word that was different, is in the version I read was slaves, not hired workers. So I just want you to maybe take a moment and just read through that again and substitute slave in that text. There was Mr. Rob over there was up here recently preaching, and he was sharing about his difficulty in the scripture, which today I can identify with. Because when I first looked at the lectionary for today, I had a moment of glee when I first started reading it, and it started off with the old mustard seed parable. I locked it in with the worship team. Well, this one will be easy. And I'm not great with memorizing scripture references or apparently reading through the scripture completely. So I had conveniently forgotten what had followed and found myself a little shocked, at least in the version that I read. Well, maybe we can just talk about mustard seeds. That's the immediate temptation. But this isn't the mustard seed parable that's found earlier in chapter 13. Also, this reference is like 20% of the gospel reading, and it's the first 20% to boot. So in this room, if we didn't talk about the reference to slavery, we would be all left with this kind of awkward feeling, like we're not talking about the elephant in the room. Given the most radical injustice that slavery was and continues to be, it would be extra weird to not talk about this example of what Jesus had used as a parable. How does the Prince of Peace, the God of justice, come to be so flippant about the use of this word in this example? Was he being flippant, or was he being intentional? What was Jesus trying to say here? And why did Luke smush these two parables together in the context of this chapter and these chapters? Because at first it seems a little bit non sequitur, but I don't think it actually is. So slavery, as it always has been, was a brutal reality in Jesus' time. I remember learning as a child that the enslavement of people was probably not as bad as we thought it was, as a way to make it palatable to young minds who couldn't possibly understand the concept of owning people. Maybe similar to what the translators of this translation was trying to do for us, make it palatable. I learned this in my Sunday school class in Indiana, where we learned the same thing about slavery in our country in Monday to Friday school. I kid you not, in Abraham Lincoln's boyhood state, we learned that slavery wasn't so bad. And enslaved people were often treated quite nicely. The white supremacist machine at work in my fourth grade classroom. However, Mercy International Association's website shares this about slavery in the Roman Empire. The institution of slavery was everywhere in the Roman Empire, where it is estimated that there was one slave to every 5 free adults, while in the city of Rome, the ratio was 1 enslaved person to 3 free adults. The lifestyle of the upper classes depended on the exploitation of slave labor work. While it was literally a different era from the racist slavery of African peoples in the United States, the brutality was similar and even more widespread. And being more widespread does not make it any more justified or right. Mercy goes on to say this: all people used as slaves were the property of their lords who bought them. They had no rights. Children born of slaves or owner-slave unions became the property of the owner, and like all people used as slaves, passed on usually to the next of kin through inheritance. The brutal punishments to which people used as slaves were subjected are well documented and included sexual assault, torture, flogging, and execution. Jesus himself underwent crucifixion, which was a form of punishment for people used as slaves. An individual, along with their family, could be enslaved because they were unable to pay their debts. Any task could be assigned to them, including the lowly task of washing feet soiled by dust and travel filth. At the master's whim, people used as slaves could be sold. So given that this is the brutal reality in which Jesus and Luke and most of their audience are living under, what was the audience to understand about their life and purpose in this world from these words? Jesus and Luke were swimming in that water. There was just no other way of seeing the world, at least in explicit justice-oriented terms. At the time, there was little thought of rising up against the systemic injustice of being used as a slave, because it was just so oppressively present and assumed, like unaddressed racism in this country. So I wonder if we can put ourselves in the audience of this text, or at least pretend like we're reading it for the first time, or more likely read to us as the ink is drying from Luke's parchment. Who are we? If we're hearing the words spoken, we are probably extremely poor to barely surviving. Or perhaps we ourselves have been called a slave. We may have owed a debt at some point and had been used as a slave to pay off that debt. Remember, 20% of us are currently being used as slaves with all the brutality and dehumanization. So this is our reality as we're hearing these words spoken to us. You know who weren't being used as slaves? The wealthy, political and religious leaders. And if we're hearing these words, and we are the very fortunate few who had any kind of property or business, we have used people as slaves. But we're probably also not showing up in large numbers to listen to Jesus. In the midst of a slew of stories and sayings from Jesus that lift up the marginalized, preaching the forgiveness of debts, the reversal of what is valued in this culture, mercy and kindness way over money. In the midst of all those stories, we have this story sandwiched. So I wonder, and please tell me if I'm being too generous to Jesus and Luke here, but I wonder if this is a story that actually functions as another subversive dig at the political and religious leaders of the time, such as the Pharisees and the Sadducees, part of Pharaoh's or Herod's court, and lifting up those everyday salt of the earth practitioners, those for whom the practice of faith and the practice of politics is not a professional privilege or greater social status. The Pharisees and the Sadducees under King Herod's rule were the untouchables, right? They were the keepers of the law, the upholders of the religious truth. This was very important work for the religious institution and the political institution of the time. But Pharisees or the Sadducees or the wealthy or the political leaders of the time would have bristled, like I did when I first read this, at having the mirror of their treatment or their allowance of the treatment of enslaved people to be shown to them. But remember, what Jesus said is the reality for the audience of the people that he surrounded himself with. Enslaved people don't get time off. If they work for a middle-class owner who can only afford one enslaved person, they are doing everything. Of course they wouldn't get thanked. Of course their owner wouldn't show mercy on them after working in the fields all day. That's not the way this enslavement system works. And yet, here were the people listening to Jesus' words stuck in that system. But they had just enough faith to show up and hear some different ways of being than were being offered by their economic system, by their political system, and even the keepers of their tradition. I think Jesus is addressing those who have showed up to hear him in the first part of the text. You have faith of a mustard seed, and right now you are just showing up. And that's all you need to do right now. Just show up. But your seedness is not the end of the story. Something will crack open in you, and in this movement, in you and in the movement around you, will grow into a mighty shrub. Like I said, this is actually a throwback to the parable of the mustard seed in chapter 13, but I love that in Matthew's version of that parable, he says the mustard seed grows into the greatest of shrubs. And I can't get Monty Python out of my head. But that should tell us something about Jesus' vision of the Christian faith, not dominating, but strong enough in its roots to make an impact on its local climate. In fact, it could even uproot a neighboring tree. It can even uproot a neighboring tree. Now that takes us back to this portion of the scripture, right? And that's the segue into the next part of the story, when Jesus shifts his attention. Because I think in the second part of the text, Jesus is addressing his opinion of the political and religious elite to the very people who would understand the reference the most. He's already praised his audience. You have a little faith, right? You showed up. The apostles represented the people who show up in spite of the world's devaluation of them, for having faith in something that they cannot see. Now he turns his attention to those who come from a different class, while still speaking to his audience. Because I think Jesus knows that they're not paying attention anyway, the people in the other class. Who among you would say to the person you enslaved, not very many in this crowd, remember, not very many in this crowd, but those who are enslaved or know someone who have been, they get it, right? When they say, who among you, Jesus is talking about the elite. This Jesus guy is speaking the truth. This is totally what it is like to be an enslaved person, they think to themselves as they hear this. But the members of King Herod's household, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, pride themselves in their stewardship of their faith, their servanthood to God and the tradition, and they demand respect, loyalty, and gratitude from the people that they hold that authority over. And Jesus asks them, do you thank the slave for doing what is commanded? So you also, when you have done all that you are ordered to do, say, we are worthless people used as slaves. We have done only what we ought to have done. Jesus is talking to the religious leadership at the time. In other words, if it is your calling to become a religious or political leader and to have any kind of power in this world, then perhaps it is time to try on some humility for a change and really identify with one's servanthood, both to God and to the people of God. Because, this goes back to that segue, if you don't, your systems will assuredly be uprooted and cast away. I'd like to think that if I'm reading this correctly in the context, that this subtle encouragement of those who have mustard seed faith to keep showing up and to grow into something disruptive, coupled with a subtle dig of those who are lording over and domineering their spirituality, was yet another reason that Jesus is a hero to all people who are working toward a world that resembles God's kingdom more closely. And that Jesus is absolutely not embedded with slaveholders or keepers of power. Those systems of oppression are to be uprooted by vulnerability, by kindness, by compassion, and by the sheer numbers of people who have decided that they've had enough isolation, enough collective grief, and are ready for mighty mustard shrubs to bloom and flourish. So I'm asking you, you're going to make this real for our community here, make this real for your city, your faith community, your neighborhood, however you want to interpret this. But what if our small mustard seed faith could uproot oppressive systems? What would that look like where you live? So I'm going to invite you to find a person if you want, and I'm gonna make sure I get this right because I don't want to lead you astray here. But part of our community, one of our values is relational conversation, and that we honor the wisdom of the gathered community alongside the wisdom of Scripture and the wisdom of the preacher or the storyteller. And so we have this practice of one-to-one relational conversations. And so I want you to not feel obligated to do this. This is only an invitation. So if you feel like you need some alone time or something like that, there's There's coffee out there. You can spend time quietly up in prayer. But if you're bold enough to find someone else to have a conversation with, find someone to talk with and ask yourselves these questions. What if our small mustard seed faith could uproot oppressive systems? What would that look like where you live? Yeah? That sound good? How much time we got? 10 minutes? Yeah? Okay. Great. So we'll start the timer now. Make sure both people have the chance to speak.